Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your warm welcome to Georgia Tech. I have looked forward very much to coming here because in my youth I wanted to be an electrical engineer. And I gather that this university has great distinction in its production of electrical engineers. But whether fortunately or unfortunately, I was persuaded to do mathematics and ended up at Cambridge in England. But thank you nonetheless for your very warm welcome. And I've been invited to address the topic, a convergent dichotomy, an Oxford mathematician on the axioms and implications of science. I'm not sure what a convergent dichotomy is, but we shall see what we make of it as we proceed. Axioms I do understand, because I spent a large part of my professional life studying the implications of a set of 4 axioms which lie at the basis of the axiomatic system called group theory. From my childhood, I was fascinated by logical analysis, and we were taught Euclidean geometry. And it was fascinating for me to see how wonderful theorems like that of Pythagoras could be deduced by a bit of logical wizardry from a very few postulates or axioms. And one of the questions people asked was, did you need all those axioms to construct the system? And I soon discovered that for centuries people had tried to deduce that Euclid's parallel axiom, his 5th postulate, they tried to deduce it from the others, and they couldn't do it. And in the 19th century, Bolyai and Lobachevsky showed that you could construct non-Euclidean geometries, hyperbolic and elliptic geometries that didn't satisfy the parallel axiom. Now, Euclid's geometry was very useful for calculating fields and buildings. But what about these new geometries? Were they any use? And it turned out that they were exactly what was needed to study space-time and were crucial to Einstein's amazing work on relativity. It was heady stuff for a schoolboy, and as a result, I fell in love with axiomatic systems. And as I say, spent my life trying to work out some of the implications of the 4 axioms that lie at the base of the abstract concept of a group that finds its application in study of symmetry, in crystallography, particle physics, relativity theory, and so on. And my subject has the distinction, whether you'd regard it as a distinction, we'll see, of having the longest theorems and proofs in history. I can well remember when Feit and Thomson, 2 American mathematicians, distinguished themselves by proving a single theorem that required a 250-page edition of a mathematical journal to prove it. But that was nothing compared with the 10,000 pages of argument required in my field to give the famous classification of finite simple groups. I'm not going to bother you with any of that tonight, you'll be glad to hear. But you know, axioms, what are they? They're fundamental postulates on which everything else is built. And so it was very natural for me to ask, what about mathematics itself? Does it have fundamental postulates? And what about science, which is larger than mathematics? Are there basic assumptions that are believed by all scientists? Or is it somehow axiom-free? And as I begin to research into this, I found all kinds of fascinating things. I noticed that all scientists believed one absolute axiom. They believed that science could be done. Now that may not strike you as important, but it is extremely important. The fact that we can do science and that belief that it can be done lies at the heart of every true scientist. If you didn't believe that, you wouldn't do science. Now, I met some people who believed that science was ever more closely approximating to a truth that was out there. And that's the position I myself would take. We call it critical realism. I also found some people who believed there was no such thing as truth, and yet they expected me to believe that what they said was true, which didn't seem to me to be particularly impressive. It was a self-contradictory axiom. I noted, incidentally, that not many of them were scientists. At least, if they were, they left their postmodernism outside the laboratory. So I then discovered that some people were so enamored with science that they believed that it was the only way to truth, and that therefore science was coextensive with rationality. Now, if that were the case, of course, half the faculties in most universities in the world, perhaps apart from this one, would have to close. I don't know whether you do any humanities here or not, but most universities do, and Harvard, for instance, would have to close half its faculties, and so would Oxford, if science was the only way to truth. Now, another thing I discovered that many people took as a fundamental postulate is that science on the one hand and faith in God on the other are at war. There was a deep-seated belief, and there still is, that scientific progress will eventually rid the world of a need for something beyond science to explain the toughest questions about the universe, as your invitation card says. So there appears to be a tension between science on the one hand and faith in God on the other. I would like to suggest that that is a false and dangerously false assumption. And it should be obvious that it's false. Take the Nobel Prize for Physics. Last year it was won by Peter Higgs, a Scotsman, much to the delight of the Scots. And he is an atheist. A few years ago, an American won it. His name is William Phillips, a low-temperature physicist. He won the same prize as Higgs, but he is a theist. He's a Christian. Now, it ought to be completely obvious that what divides these two men is not their science. They have both won the top prize in physics in the world. What divides them is their world view. Peter Higgs, an atheist, William Phillips, a Christian. And I want to suggest to you that we'll never understand the contemporary debate unless we see that we are faced in this academy, as in every others, with two diametrically opposed worldviews. Worldviews, of course, are our set of answers to the big questions of life. And one of the questions that's been asked since the time of the ancient Greeks is, what is the nature of ultimate reality? What is the really real? And Democritus and Leucippus, who were the brilliant fathers of the atomic theory, they had the idea that you could keep dividing matter up and up and up until you reached an atom, atomos, something that could not be cut. Now, of course, we know that they were wrong, but it was a brilliant idea. And they then approached ultimate reality in this way. They said, well, there are two fundamental things constituting reality. There are the atoms and there is empty space. And therefore their view of explanation depended on this fundamental postulate. Everything had to be explained bottom up in terms of atoms and the void. So they came up with theories like the atoms fell through empty space and they agglomerated and they formed galaxies and stars. You know the story. That is the philosophy we often call materialism. Now, at the same time, there were people like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle who believed, yes, the physical world is real, but the really real is something beyond the physical world. There is transcendence. There are the gods, or there is God. And so, barreling up towards us in the 21st century, there are those diametrically opposed worldviews and various shades, of course, in between. But one tends to find that the so-called tension between science and belief in God is a misrepresentation of the tension between those two worldviews. And the interesting thing, to my mind, is this: there are scientists on both sides. There are engineers on both sides. There are very high-powered thinking people on both sides of that divide. So that is the first point. I suggest that it's a worldview tension, and it's not a tension between science and belief in God. So the real question we need to ask is this: if we believe in God as the creator and sustainer of the universe, does that in itself create tension with a scientific approach to reality? Or do those two approaches in some sense converge, even though they are very different? The key question then for me is this: granted that there are those two worldviews and others in between, in which direction does science point? Where does it sit? Does it, like Richard Dawkins would suggest, point towards atheism? Or does it, as I would suggest, point towards theism? So we can only decide things like this by looking for evidence. Now, I emphasize the word evidence. I'm not talking about mathematical proof, because mathematical proof, in the narrow sense, you only find in pure mathematics. You don't find it in physics, you don't find it in chemistry, you don't find it in engineering. In all of those other fields, more strictly, we should refer to evidence. Now, it can be immensely powerful evidence. For example, I flew yesterday in a plane from London to Atlanta. I believe there was enough evidence to trust this particular Boeing to take me here. That is, I trust the engineers, and I'm staking my life on their competence. So just because there's no mathematical proof doesn't mean we can't have enough evidence on which to stake our lives. And of course, in other things, even more important than engineering, I cannot prove to you mathematically that my wife, who's been my wife for 46 years, I can't prove to you mathematically that she loves me, but I'd stake my life on it because I have 46 years of evidence that she does so. Now, you understand that kind of thing. Commitment in science, as in life, is made on the basis of evidence. And we'll return to that in a little bit. So, where does science sit vis-a-vis faith in God? Well, the first stunning fact, and it is a stunning fact, I believe, although I've been familiar with it for many years, it's this: that modern science traces its roots to the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries with people like Galileo and Kepler and Newton. And you will all know, of course, that these men believed in God. And that is no accident, according to historians of science. Think of Alfred Whitehead, who said this: Europe in 1500 knew less than Archimedes, who died in 212 BC. And yet 200 years later, Newton's Principia had been written. And he raises the question, why? What was it about Europe at that time that made it so congenial for the explosion that we call modern science to occur? So here's Whitehead. It must come from the medieval insistence on the rationality of God, conceived as with the personal energy of Jehovah and the rationality of a Greek philosopher. The impress on the European mind arising from the unquestioned faith of centuries. Putting it slightly more simply and more expressively, C.S. Lewis wrote this, and he was referring to Whitehead. Men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. Now that is very interesting, isn't it? Let me put it bluntly, ladies and gentlemen. I am not remotely ashamed to be both a scientist and a Christian, because arguably Christianity gave me my subject. You see, far from hindering science, it was faith in a rational creator that was the motor that drove science. So that was Newton, that was Kepler, that was Galileo. Now comes the problem. Isaac Newton's chair, until recently, was occupied by Stephen Hawking, who was just a bit ahead of me in Cambridge and light years ahead of me in his mathematical brain power, incidentally. But I remember him very well. He says, in his book co-authored with Leonard Mlodinow, The Grand Design, that you've got to choose between science and God. Isaac Newton says it was his faith in God that was the motor that drove his science. What has happened? And I want to try and explain what has happened so that we can understand what is going on. Why is it that certain leading scientists now claim that you cannot believe in God and be a credible scientist, when the early pioneers all fitted into that category? Well, of course, and I did 2 Veritas forums in the Netherlands last week, and in each of them, the first one was a physicist I was debating, and the argument he came up with was that we've now discovered that God is a delusion like Santa Claus. The sociologist that I debated in the second one said exactly the same thing. So there's obviously a great deal of interest in Santa Claus these days. Now, it seems to me, ladies and gentlemen, that it's perfectly obvious that God is not in the same category as Santa Claus. I mean, have you ever met an adult that came to believe in Santa Claus? Have you? Of course not. Some of you are awake, obviously, but just a few. I have met many adults who've come to believe in God. I haven't met one who came to believe in Santa Claus. Now, the Santa Claus idea is responsible, it's in the title essentially of Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, of many people not thinking about this subject at all, because they've accepted Freudianism in Freud's idea that all this kind of talk is an illusion. God is a wish fulfillment, a projection of our desire for a father figure in the sky and all the rest of it. Well, it won't quite do, actually, because Germany's leading psychiatrist, Manfred Lutz, has just written a fascinating best-selling book called Eine kleine Geschichte des Größten, a brief history of the Great One. It's not in English yet, I'm afraid. But in it, he argues this. He said, look, if there is no God, then Freud's argument is wonderful, a wonderful argument why religion is a delusion, and we can forget about it, if there is no God. Of course, he says if there is a God, the very same argument will show you that it's atheism that's a delusion. The projected desire never having to meet God or to be held accountable for the things that we've done in our lives. And Lutz's bottom line, which he puts very clearly, is this: on the substantive question, whether there's a God or not, neither Freud, Frankl, nor Jung can help you one little bit. You'll have to look elsewhere. And yet people still make these assertions. Hawking said not long ago, religion is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. And I was asked by the London Times how I responded to that. And I said, well, atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. Well, you shouldn't laugh, really, because that proves nothing on the basis of what I've said. But it's easy to make these assertions. We've got to go deeper into the subject matter. Why then the opposition between science and God? Well, one of the reasons is explained to you on the card that you got before you came in. As science continues to explain questions once thought to be the result of the supernatural, the gaps for which science has no answer seem to be narrowing, along with the need for something supernatural to fill them. So when we have debates in Oxford from time to time. Every year we have a God debate where we dress up in dinner jackets, and we have a confrontational parliamentary debate about God. And last year I was on the Christian side, and Michael Shermer, known to many of you, editor of Skeptic magazine, was on the atheist side. And during the discussion he looked at me and he said, of course, he said, you're an atheist. You're an atheist with respect to it. He started with A for Artemis, B for Baal, and so on, and went through the alphabet until he got to Z for Zeus. And he said, you are an atheist with respect to all these gods. And I confessed it immediately. I am, ladies and gentlemen, an a-Zeusist. I do not believe in Zeus. And then he delivered the bottom line, and he says, we just go one God further, and we get rid of Jehovah, the God of the Bible. And I thought, what an amazingly interesting argument, because it shows he knows nothing about the ancient gods of the ancient Near East. Because people who write authoritatively about those gods have pointed out a very significant fact about them. They are descended from the primeval universe. They appeared, whatever they were, they appeared from the matter of the original universe. And Werner Jaeger, a world expert on these gods, points out that the God of the Bible is utterly distinct. He did not descend from the heavens and the earth. He created the heavens and the earth. So the first point to realize is they're not talking about the same God. And that alerts me to the deeper question here. You see, the ancient Greek gods were gods of the gaps. Think of the god of thunder. I don't think Georgia Tech would believe in the god of thunder, because you've got a department, I imagine, of atmospheric physics, and 10 minutes in there will soon convince you that there's no god of thunder. You can explain thunder by temperature gradients, electrostatic discharges, and all the rest of it. So exit the god of thunder. That is, the god of thunder was only ever merely a god of the gaps, a placeholder until science made an advance. Now, what I discovered today, and it took me a long time to really realize it, is this notion of a god of the gaps has become so widespread that many people, particularly atheists, but not only atheists, think that that's what people like me believe. Now, try and follow the logic of this. If God is a god of the gaps, then of course you've got to choose between him and science, because you've defined God as a placeholder until the scientific knowledge comes. But the God in whom I believe, ladies and gentlemen, is not a God of the gaps. He's the God of the whole show. He's the God of the bits I don't understand, and he's the God of the bits I do understand. So he doesn't disappear with every new scientific advance. Newton, of course, saw that, and the others saw it as well. So when Newton discovered his brilliant law of gravitation, he didn't say, wonderful, I've got a law, I've got an explanation, I don't need God. No, what did he do? He wrote Principia Mathematica, one of the most famous books, if not the most famous book in the history of science, expressing the hope in it that it would bring the thinking person to believe in a deity. Because you see, the more Newton uncovered of the way the universe worked, the more he admired the genius of the God that did it that way. And I suspect that's happened to you studying engineering here. I'm not an expert engineer. I can see a Rolls-Royce engine and see it looks beautiful. But if you studied engineering, and you know exactly how it works and the tolerances with which it's machined, you can say, you know, it took an absolute genius to design that gearbox. In other words, the more you understand of the gearbox, the more you admire the genius of the person who designed it, not the less. And so it is that the more I understand of the universe, the more I admire the genius of the God who did it that way. Now, here comes the important point. The confusion lies in thinking that God is the same kind of explanation as science gives. And that's false, of course. You all know, and you were probably introduced to it in school, why is the kettle boiling? Well, it's boiling because there's been a heat input of energy from a Bunsen burner. The molecules of water are vibrating faster and faster and faster, and still steam begins to come off. No, that's not why it's boiling. It's boiling because I want a cup of tea. And you laugh. Well, which of those explanations is correct? And you say, don't be silly. They're both correct. You see, in ordinary life, we're used to complementary explanations. If we're thinking of a Ford motor car, and I say, well, let me give you two explanations. One is internal combustion and automobile engineering. The other is Henry Ford. Please choose. You would think I was a consummate idiot, wouldn't you? Because you need both. Now, surely we can all see that Henry Ford does not compete or conflict with automobile engineering and the law of internal combustion as an explanation for the motor car engine. You need both to give you a fully orbed explanation. In other words, to abstract from that, you need explanation in terms of mechanism and law on the one hand, that's the scientific explanation, and in terms of agency on the other, Henry Ford. And it's the same with the universe. An explanation in terms of mechanism and law is not an argument against an explanation in terms of an agent. In fact, there would be no universe at all for physicists to study if God hadn't created it. So it seems to me that a great deal of the confusion in this debate is failure to see the different levels of explanation. Now, there's a little warning to be added in here. We all know what it means to say science explains, or do we? The law of gravitation. What does that explain? Well, it explains how to calculate, even without Einstein's corrections, putting a person on the moon. Absolutely brilliant stuff. And I was so excited when I discovered Newton's law. But does it tell you what gravity is? No. Newton realized that, but many contemporary scientists do not realize it. Nobody knows what gravity is. Nobody knows what energy is. You see, even at that level, science explains has got limitations of which we're often unconscious. And the great philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein put it this way. He said, the great deception of modernity is that the laws of nature are explanations of the phenomena of nature when there are no such thing. They are descriptions of the phenomena of nature. They enable us to predict certain events, and they can be very powerful, but they are not explanations in that fullest sense. So what am I suggesting? I'm suggesting, number one, the antagonism, supposed, between God on the one hand and science on the other is to set up false alternatives. And they get set up, firstly, on the basis of a false understanding of God. Understanding God as a God of the gaps, of course you have to choose between God and science. But I've never met a sensible Christian, Muslim, or Jew who believed in a God of the gaps. Secondly, the nature of scientific explanation. It deals with a certain level of explanation. It doesn't deal with agency. And the existence of a mechanism or a law that does something is not in itself an argument for the non-existence of an agent who designed the mechanism. So very frequently, because I'm a mathematician, people say to me, oh, I'm like Laplace, who was showing his equations for ballistics to Napoleon. And Napoleon said to him, Mr. Laplace, where is God in all these equations? And Laplace said, je n'ai pas besoin de cette hypothèse. I don't need that hypothesis. Well, of course not. He was talking about the laws governing motions of ballistics through the atmosphere or through a vacuum. And when I'm teaching that in class in Oxford, I don't mention God either. He was answering the question he was asked. But if the question had been different, if it had been, Mr. Laplace, how is it that there is a universe at all in which the laws of motion operate, then he might have had to mention God, mightn't he? Now, I'm well aware at this point that Richard Dawkins looms large, and I meet it everywhere I go, and I'll meet it here tonight, so I might as well answer it before I'm asked it. And that is this. Look, putting God in at any level as an explanation is nonsensical, because if you believe, as I do, that God created the universe, then you will have to ask, who created God? And then you'll have to ask, who created the creator that created the creator, and so on. It goes on forever, and so it's nonsense. So let's forget about it and go and play football and do something sensible. Well, this who created God question, I was amazed to find Richard Dawkins using it. Because you see, if you ask the question, who created God? Well, let's abstract from it. Who or what created X? The assumption behind the question is, of course, that X was created. Well, we know that created gods are a delusion, and if Dawkins' book had been called The Created Gods Delusion, I don't think anybody would have bought it. You see, philosophers have a word for this. They call it a complex question because it hides assumptions that hide the real issue. If you say, who created God, you're immediately assuming that what you're talking about was created. But the central claim of Christianity, and indeed Islam and Judaism, is that God is eternal. He wasn't created, so the question doesn't apply to him. But there's this thing in its tail, as I pointed out to Richard Dawkins. I said to him, I think I'm going to ask you your own question. You believe the universe created you. So please tell me who created your creator. I've waited 7 years for the answer to that. You see, what is really at issue, ladies and gentlemen, is the question of what is ultimate reality. Do the questions go back forever? And I think on both sides they don't. For me as a Christian, the ultimate reality is God. He is the creator, he is eternal. And for many of my atheist friends, and I have many of them, the ultimate reality is the multiverse, mass energy, something like that. They don't go back forever. So the real question is not whether there's an ultimate reality or not, but which reality is ultimate? Is it God or is it the universe? Now, related to that is this. God cannot be an explanation at any level because explanation, by definition, particularly in the scientific world, always proceeds from the simple to the complex. It's reductionistic. It reduces complicated things to simple things. As Dawkins says in his book, that his objective is to explain elephants and so on in terms of physics and chemistry. So therefore, if you postulate God as the explanation for the universe, then God is infinitely more complex than the universe, so it's no explanation at all. I take that seriously. And when I came to discuss it with Richard Dawkins, I said, there is one area where that doesn't work. I pick up a book, it's called The God Delusion. It's 400 pages long, roughly speaking. It's quite complicated. So I ask, what is its origin? And I discover its origin is in the infinitely more complicated mind of Richard Dawkins. So I dismiss that explanation, because the explanation is much more complicated than the thing you're explaining. That's exactly his argument. And you see, ladies and gentlemen, explanation, reductionist explanation, is extremely powerful. But there's one area I want to suggest to you where we all realize it does not work. And that is where language is involved, where information is involved. I have often sat with leading scientists who have said they believe everything can be explained bottom up in terms of physics and chemistry. And on one famous occasion in Oxford, but it's been repeated, I was sitting with the director of one of the biochemistry labs. And he said that we had nothing to talk about because he discovered rather too rapidly that I believed in God. And he said at dinner he was an atheist and we were going to have a miserable evening, which is not the best way to begin a dinner. And I said, no, you're a reductionist. I am very interested in reductionism. I know at least 3 kinds. And I know one we share in common at least, and that's methodological reductionism. We split a big problem into little problems. We study the little problems and get insight for the big problems. He said, that's what I do. I said, good. But he said, that's not what I mean. I said, no, it isn't. I know it's not what you mean. What you mean is that everything can be exhaustively explained in terms of physics and chemistry. He said, exactly. So I picked up the menu and I said, why don't we do an experiment? And he said, what, here at the dinner table? I said, yes, this is Oxford, why not? So he said, what's the problem? It says roast chicken. I said, yes, it does. And look at it, R-O-A-S-T. Look at those marks on paper. They carry meaning. You've already interpreted the meaning. Now I said, those marks, R-O-A-S-T, in that order and with that shape, are semiotic. They carry meaning. He said, exactly. Okay, I said, have a go. Explain to me the semiotics in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. And his wife, who was sitting beside him, said rather too loudly, get out of that if you can. But his answer stunned me. He didn't try to get out of it. He said it can't be done. I was so shocked. I said, what do you mean? Physics and chemistry have only been running for 500 or 600 years. He said, it doesn't matter. You cannot do it because it involves semiotics and meaning. The explanatory power of physics and chemistry is not adequate to account for the meaning. And then he said, where did you get that argument? He could say I wasn't clever enough to have thought of it myself. And so I confessed that I got it from a Nobel Prize-winning medic called Roger Sperry. Now, here's the interesting thing about that little story, ladies and gentlemen. He said the situation with the semiotics, with the language, demands an explanation in terms of an intelligence. An intelligence of the gaps? Are we back with the God of the gaps? Well, no and yes. It depends on the nature of the gap. Because what I think we need to take on board is there are what I call good gaps and bad gaps. The bad gaps are closed by science. The good gaps are opened by science, and this is one of them. Now, I'm interested as a mathematician in trying to understand the very difficult subject of the theory of information. And you see, if you study the works of people like Leonard Brillouin, and above all, Gregory Chaitin, his work on information theory and the basic ideas that surround it, that a machine can transmit information but not generate it. That, to my mind, is utterly fascinating. Now, this is a difficult topic, and there's a lot of argument about whether it applies completely here or not, but it suggests something very important. Because the human cell is an information processor. It is a machine. It's more than a machine. Now, if it is a machine, then what we're faced with, that machines cannot, and I'm quoting Brillouin now, generate any information that's not either in their informational structure or in their input. That would suggest to me that a purely naturalistic account is doomed to failure if the capacity to produce something linguistic is involved, which is why, of course, the moment you see letters on paper or your name written in the beach, you immediately infer upwards to an intelligence. No matter how many automatic processes which you may not have seen are involved in putting those letters in the beach, you infer upwards to an intelligence. Well, we have lived to discover the longest word that's ever been discovered. It's called the human genome. It's 4.5 billion letters long, roughly speaking, in a 4-letter alphabet. The codons that form it. So you've got this 3.5 billion letter long word, everything exactly in the right order like a computer program. And I ask many people these days, what is the ultimate origin of this? And they say chance and the laws of nature. I say, hold on a minute. You see your own name written on a beach and you immediately infer intelligence. Why don't you infer it here? Because you see, ladies and gentlemen, every analogy we know, all the experience we have, both within and without science, tells us that where there's language, there is a mind. Now, what I'm suggesting to you, therefore, is this, as we move into the question time, is that these worldviews can be put in a slightly different way. The atomist worldview of materialism starts essentially in the beginning with the particles, and the particles generated the worlds, and the worlds generated life, and life generated consciousness, and consciousness generated the mind, and the mind generated the idea of God, because there isn't a God. The other worldview goes like this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be that came to be. And here is the biblical solution to the question that's been asked again and again in a series of books by Stephen Hawking, Lawrence Krauss, and so on. Why is there something rather than nothing? The answer is because an infinite, eternal God caused it to be. If you deny his existence, you have a massive problem, as any reading of the books by Hawking and Krauss will show. They have not solved the problem. Their nothing from which they claim the universe started is no such thing. It is alive with potentiality. It is a quantum vacuum. And I had the opportunity to debate Alan Guth, the father of the idea of inflation, which has been confirmed by the experiments at the South Pole on gravity waves. And I said to him in public at the MIT Harvard Faculty Club, I said, Alan, there's a great deal of confusion out there about nothing. I said, look, the nothing that you think the universe came from is not the nothing that most of us believe that nothing consists in. That's the absence of anything. He said, no, it isn't. I said, thank you very much. They have not solved the problem because, of course, if you are driven by the standard model, and here's the fascinating thing, to believe in a starting point for space-time, you are driven, therefore, to believe there was nothing in the philosophical sense before that. And so you're presented with a massive problem. How do you get something from nothing? But the physicists can't get something that's physical from nothing that's non-physical. So they have to redefine nothing to be physical. Listen to Lawrence Krauss's definition. He says in his book, because something is physical, nothing must also be physical, especially if it's defined as the absence of something. What? I was staggered when I read that. But ladies and gentlemen, it seems to me that here we come to a very interesting pointer from science towards God. Alan Sandage is regarded rightly as one of the fathers of modern cosmology. He discovered the quasar. And he says, you know, God to me is a mystery. But he is the answer to the question why there is something rather than nothing. I make the point again. If God hadn't created and didn't sustain the universe, there would be nothing for you in Georgia Tech to study. Thank you very much.